Alrighty, 15th of November 2025, and this is going to follow directly on from the first two episodes on this essay of Jung's called Christ, a Symbol of the Self, which is from Aion, paragraph 68 through 126, and we're up to paragraph 96. And I'm simply going to continue diving headlong into what this is, hoping to elucidate what Jung is saying here. Yeah, so Jung was talking about evil. I might give the final paragraph, which was 95, and it went, it is probably from this tendency to deny any reality to evil that we get the axiom, all good comes from God, all evil comes from man. This is a contradiction of the truth that he who created the heat is also responsible for the cold. We can certainly hand it to Augustine that all natures are good, yet just not good enough to prevent their badness from being equally obvious. So, as we were talking about, Jung is taking issue with the Christian doctrine of the privation of evil as the privation of good. So, evil in this scheme through people like Irenaeus, St. Augustine, Basil the Great, these early Christian theologians regarded evil as the privation of good. And Jung claims that they did this in order to distinguish themselves from Manicheism, which really saw this struggle between light and darkness, good and evil, as a dualism that was sort of ontological or metaphysical. The Christians didn't like this. So they regarded evil as lacking in substance, lacking existence, regarding it instead as a privation of the good, since a God who's by definition all good would not create evil. And Jung takes issue with this, saying that our regard for God as all good is a philosophical definition or quality that we ascribe to God. And for Jung, there is a sort of empirical reality to evil. He feels that good and evil are human judgments rather than inherent qualities of reality. And so his argument that we see clearly the reality of evil, which we may be blind to if we believe in evil merely as the privation of good. Jung feels that this doesn't imply a metaphysical dualism. He's making a psychological claim about the reality of good and evil as human judgments that are reasonable to use, that can resolve itself in an understanding and indeed experience of the divine or sacred as that which is beyond duality. So that's a rough summary of Jung's understanding. So he's saying that God has indeed created people and things which are indeed minimally good and maximally bad, which is reasonable to call evil. And it's not that, like, it's true that all natures are good, but it's also true that all natures are bad. I'm thinking here of Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. We also see this in Viktor Frankl, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare. There's a long list of people who can hold this paradoxical tension between opposites within our own natures. I mean, William Blake, John Milton, Dante. It's like these are some heavy hitters. Um, anyway, so it seems that we tend to deny evil a reality, and instead the Christian doctrine that we've sort of inherited and steeped in for millennia is a sort of preference to regard evil as coming from ourselves, being the source of evil. And we may fall to this from not wanting to, like it might be unimaginable, unthinkable that God could produce evil as much as good. And so it may be less confronting to put the origin of evil upon ourselves. And I can see why, like when people have experienced for a very long time that God is in fact good, capital G good, that regarding it as a source of evil is feels untenable. Somehow, I mean, like if we to use the word at all, evil, then it seems to me that the positions are ultimately reconcilable. If we regard God, capital G, good as a kind of good which is beyond good and evil, and therefore which has indeed created what we regard as good and evil on a kind of smaller level, non-capitalized level. Um, I don't feel that that's an inherent contradiction, but I guess most people get stuck in that it seems reasonable to question the quote unquote goodness of a deity who would create evil as it is. I mean, certainly, I think if we're willing to see evil in human nature, we can regard that maybe as created by humans. But I think if we see that, then I don't see why we can't also see evil in nature, either in evil in the spiritual sphere of life that we are not the origin of. Jung's pointing to in the Christian mythology, the origins of the fall of the devil that was on page 86, which I might briefly recount that felt important to me when thinking about this. If, quote, if the devil fell away from God of his own free will, this proves firstly that evil was in the world before man, and therefore that man cannot be the sole author of it. And secondly, that the devil already had a mutilated soul, for which we must hold a real cause responsible. So the suggestion is that God may have had the influence of a creator over um, the options that were available to the devil, quote unquote, that influenced his capacity to choose freely to fall. How is it that he was even able to fall? Anyway, let's continue after the break. So back to 96. It seems that we prefer to regard ourselves as the source of evil, and this leads to a lot of self-abnegation, self-flagellation. 96, quote, one could hardly call the things that have happened and still happen in the concentration camps of the dictator states an accidental lack of perfection. It would sound like mockery. And that might seem relegated to World War II. It's very much not. There are millions of people still living under slavery throughout Asia and Africa in the modern world. You know, many, many people living in very harsh conditions that we do have some control over. Industrial farming also comes to mind. I believe there's a slave calculator where you can go online and put in your quality of life, and it will tell you how many slaves need to exist in order to support your way of life through things like rare earth metals in our phones, things like that. Anyway, Jung is here saying that the concentration camps, like when we really look at evil in this way, and it seems to me that we really haven't digested what really happened during World War II. And that those concentration camps were bred like a disease, and they were spread the teachings of evil to through South America when the Nazis ran, when they escaped. And this style of concentration camps and horrible things like torture techniques have been passed from evil group to evil group, that it becomes very easy to vilify, show up in, for example, Bush, the axis of evil. The world gets very easily split into this light and darkness, dualism. You were saying that evil is real, and that such things as concentration camps are not an accidental lack of perfection. He feels that when we regard ourselves as the source of evil, that we become blinded, or that we run the risk of becoming blinded to the reality of evil. And so he goes on, psychology does not know what good and evil are in themselves. It knows them only as judgments about relationships. Good is what seems suitable, acceptable, or valuable from a certain point of view, from a certain perspective. Evil is its opposite. If the things we call good are really good, then there must be evil things that are real too. It is evident that psychology is concerned with a more or less subjective judgment, i.e., with a psychic antithesis that cannot be avoided in naming value relationships. Good denotes something that is not bad, and bad, something that is not good. There are many things which, from a certain point of view, are extremely evil, that is to say, dangerous. There are also things in human nature which are very dangerous, and which therefore seem proportionately evil to anyone standing in their line of fire. It is pointless to gloss over these evil things, because that only lulls one into a sense of false security. Human nature is capable of an infinite amount of evil, and the evil deeds are as real as the good ones, so far as human experience goes, and so far as the psyche judges and differentiates between them. Only unconsciousness makes no difference between good and evil. Inside the psychological realm, one honestly does not know which of them predominates in the world. We hope merely that the good does, i.e., what seems suitable to us. No one could possibly say what the general good might be. No amount of insight into the relativity and fallibility of our moral judgment can deliver us from these defects. And those who deem themselves beyond good and evil are usually the worst tormentors of mankind, because they are twisted with the pain and fear of their own sickness. So that was a lot. I would say that what Jung is pointing to really is the relativity of our perspective. That we have a certain perspective, and that when we render judgment, we do so from our human perspective. That we judge that something is good, that being is good, or that being is evil, or that something is good or evil. And he's arguing that we're not in a position to say whether the totality is good or evil. We simply hope that it is. He was arguing that good and evil are judgments that we make, that some things are very dangerous and hence easily regarded to be evil and reasonably seen to be so. that some things in human nature are like this? There is indeed a real distinction between what is good and what is evil, and it is judged by our consciousness. That we're not in a position, we don't have the perspective from which to judge the whole. We're stuck with evil, we're not beyond it. Quote, today as never before, it is important that human beings should not overlook the danger of the evil lurking within them. Today as never before, it's important that human beings should not overlook the danger of the evil lurking within them. This is one of the central points of Jung's whole over, I don't know how to say that word, but and this is we see this through people like Schmachtenberger as well, that the consequences of our choice making are now so significant because of the power of the technology that is at our disposal, that it is the problem of the nature within us and how to work with and manage and be with and know ourselves is the central problem of our time. And that blindness to the empirical reality of the evil within us is one of the main mistakes that we can make. We have to recognize the evil within us. It is unfortunately only too real, which is why psychology must insist on the reality of evil and must reject any definition that regards it as insignificant or actually non-existent. Psychology is an empirical science and deals with realities. As a psychologist, therefore, I have neither the inclination nor the competence to mix myself up with metaphysics. Only I have to get polemical when metaphysics encroaches on experience and interprets it in a way that is not justified empirically. My criticism of the privatio boni, of the doctrine of evil as the privation of good, holds only so far as psychological experience goes. From the scientific point of view, the privatio boni, as must be apparent to everyone, is founded on a petitio principii, circular reasoning, where what invariably comes out at the end is what you put in at the beginning. Arguments of this kind have no power of conviction. But the fact that such arguments are not only used, but undoubtedly believed, is something that cannot be disposed of so easily. It proves that there is a tendency existing right from the start to give priority to good, and to do so with all the means in our power, whether suitable or unsuitable. So if Christian metaphysics clings to the privatio boni, it is giving expression to the tendency always to increase the good and diminish the bad. The privatio boni, evil is the privation of good, may therefore be a metaphysical truth. I presume to no judgment on this matter. It may therefore be a metaphysical truth. I presume to no judgment on this matter. I must only insist that in our field of experience, white and black, light and dark, good and bad are equivalent opposites, which always predicate one another. Okay, a couple things here. You're saying He's saying first and foremost that psychology as a discipline insists on the reality of evil, and it's based on the empirical evidence of real evil, that evil cannot be regarded as simply the privation of good. It's something in its own right. He argues that the argument of evil is the privation of good, lacks conviction because it's derived from a certain kind of circular reasoning. He's not ultimately making a metaphysical claim in this context. He's saying that there are polarities which structure our field of experience and that go together, among them good and evil. We can see here how it's ultimately possible to reconcile these positions. It is possible to hold a metaphysics or an ontology that involves capital G good, the good, or God as all good, Platonism or Christianity, for example, while at the same time holding to, the empirical observation of the reality of good and evil. And I think we can see it may be necessary to hold both of those at the same time to get out of this thicket with everything intact. Failure conditions on either side being that if we only emphasize the goodness, metaphysical goodness, then we ignore the empirical evil, are blinded to it, and don't deal with it, and are destroyed. And vice versa, if we reify the empirical dualism of good and evil into a metaphysics, then we come to an understanding of God as demiurge, which is in some ways quite depressing. And there's a real risk of dualism there, to say the least, of the risks that come from that Gnostic direction. So holding both seems important. I would also say one more thing here is that there's been an understanding sort of running throughout this that revelation can act as a corrective. That for example, the revelation of Christ was able to introduce humanity to a new form of ensoulment through the power of agape. That's through Viveki here. And this is sort of implicit in Jung, the power and importance, like the normative valence of revelation. And I would suggest that the fact of revelation, sorry, the fact of evil is not necessarily corrected by revelation. It may be that there may be ultimate convergence between the moral dimension of being and I don't know, the direction or dimension of being that gets toward greater ontological depth or reality. I can give one example that the Aztecs did a lot of human sacrifice and also used mushrooms a lot. I'll leave that there. Let's continue. So Jung, so if Christian metaphysics clings to the privatio boni, it's giving expression to the tendency always to increase the good and diminish the bad. The privatio boni may therefore be a metaphysical truth. I presume to no judgment on this matter. I must only insist that in our field of experience, white and black, light and dark, good and bad, are equivalent opposites, which always predicate one another. This elementary fact was correctly appreciated in the so-called Clementine homilies, a collection of Gnostic Christian writings dating from about AD 150. The unknown author understands good and evil as the right and left hand of God and views the whole of creation in terms of syzygies, or pairs of opposites. In much the same way, the follower of Bardesanes, named Marinus, sees good as light and pertaining to the right hand, and evil as dark and pertaining to the left. the left hand. Or the left also corresponds to the feminine. Thus, in Irenaeus, who was an early Christian author, Sophia Pranikos, which is a name, Sophia Pranikos is called Sinistra. So this is age-old association between darkness, evil, left, and femininity. Clement finds this altogether compatible with the idea of God's unity, provided that one has an anthropomorphic God image, and every God image is anthropomorphic in a more or less subtle way. The logic and naturalness of Clement's view can hardly be contested. So just pausing, Jung thinks that this guy Clement really understood this. So it's quite possible to see categories such as good and evil, light and dark, masculine, feminine. It's certainly a way of seeing it. I I don't think we maybe also want to cultivate the capacity to see it in other ways. But roughly, Jung thinks that Clement's view is quite natural. He's arguing, furthermore, that the images of God that we produce are always anthropomorphic and hence, to some degree, always include the idea of evil in the idea of God's unity. Evil is unified in God. Or at all events, this view of Clement's, which may be some 200 years older than the quotations given above, proves that the reality of evil does not necessarily lead to Manichean dualism, and so does not endanger the unity of the God image. As a matter of fact, it guarantees that unity on a plane beyond the crucial difference between the Yahwistic and Christian points of view. Yahweh is notoriously unjust, and injustice is not good. The God of Christianity, on the other hand, is only good. There's no denying that Clement's theology helps us to get over this contradiction in a way that fits the psychological facts. Okay, this was quite important. So first of all, according to Jung, evil is a psychic reality. Our ideas of God express and embody unity despite that fact. And therefore, all dualities, including that of good and evil, are united in the wholeness of God, whose totality contains all. So there's this independence, this duality is able to exist at a psychological or psychic sort of empirical level, and one can still make a metaphysical claim that God is unified. And so there's a vision here which quite guarantees a unity on a plane between, or sort of beyond the difference between the Old Testament and New Testament gods. So this is talking about a vision which unifies and unites the Yahwistic and Christian perspectives on God. Okay, let's continue. 100. It is therefore worth following up Clement's line of thought a little more closely. God, he says, appointed two kingdoms and two ages, determining that the present world should be given over to evil, because it is small and passes quickly away. But he promised to preserve the future world for good, because it is great and eternal. Just on that, like I think we can clearly see here how, in comparison to a vision of greatness and eternality, by comparison, what appears from a relative point of view to be small and to pass quickly away in temporality becomes so easily and quickly associated with evil. It's so easy to reify this two worlds mythology by positing what I would call a utopian vision. And it's really tricky because it may be necessary for us to be striving toward a vision. Tricky, tricky, tricky. Anyway, it says Clement goes on to say that this division into two, the present world, which is given over to evil because it's small and passes quickly away, and the future world, which is good because it's great and eternal. Clement says that this division into two corresponds to the structure of man, that the body comes from the female, who's characterized by emotionality, and that the spirit comes from the male, who stands for rationality. He calls body and spirit the two triads. So we have these two triads here. I've drawn them, but it's like the first one is body, female, evil, and emotionality, and also connected with the small world that passes quickly away. And then the second category, the spirit, the male, the good, which is connected with rationality, and the eternal world, which is great. And I think we can see, like, if you just take out the good and evil from that, and for example, apply a little Taoism, like a sprinkling of Taoism into the mix, we can see that like there's no inherent qualitative difference uh, that distinguishes male and female, or body and spirit, um, or rationality and emotionality, or the eternal or the temporal, or the great or the small. It's not that one of those is so obviously worse and one of them is so obviously better. Well, I don't think so. I don't think that the eternal is obviously better than the temporal. And the whole point is to, if we can hold both of those, again, I took out good and evil. Well, then as soon as you introduce this moral valence into the mix, we can see how it just tips the whole thing so that half becomes laden with this affective valence that results in witch burnings and heretic burnings and inquisitions and crusades and a repression of the body for millennia. Like look how propositionally tyrannical our emotionally repressed, Victorian-esque culture it's become. I mean, this is, Freud, rolls in grave, kind of like guys, you can't just, you know, you can't be connecting the body and all the women with evil. It's not appropriate to do that. Like, and this is big news, right? Because we're in this symbolic category. This is connected with this lower world, which is temporal and small in comparison to this vision of heaven, which is so, I would say, seductive. And we're really going to have to spend a lot of time unlearning this. This is, I think, Jung's whole point that there are these two triads here, body, female, evil, spirit, male, good, that we want to take that out of the moral valence that we've been taught to apply without being blinded to the reality of evil. It's not about justifying evil, it's about meeting it more appropriately. Anyway, we were talking about Clement, who said, so he's calling, he was just talking about this division between these worlds, and we were saying that Clement goes on to say that this division into two corresponds to the structure of man. The body comes from the female, who's characterized by emotionality. The spirit comes from the male, who stands for rationality. He calls body and spirit the two triads. And then we quote from him, Clement, who says, man is a compound of two mixtures, the female and the male. Wherefore also two ways have been laid before him, those of obedience and those of disobedience to law, and two kingdoms have been established, the one called the kingdom of heaven, and the other the kingdom of those who are now rulers upon earth. Of these two, the one does violence to the other. Moreover, these two rulers are the swift hands of God, their right and left hands. There's a reference to Deuteronomy 32:39, quote, I will kill and I will make to live. He kills with the left hand and saves with the right. More from Clement. These two principles have not their substance outside of God, for there is no other primal source. There is no other primal source, nor have they been sent forth from God as animals, for they were of the same mind with him. But from God were sent forth the four first elements, hot and cold, moist and dry. In consequence of this, he is the father of every substance, but not of though he is the father of every substance, but not of the knowledge which arises from the mixing of the elements. For when these were combined from without, choice was begotten in them as a child. Recall in passing that Jung was saying in regards to the revelation of Christ, this was in the first episode, that the revelation of Christ in combination with the soul as sponsor bride of Christ in this hieros gamos, resulted in this symbolism of the hieros gamos, the mystical marriage or chemical wedding, the alchemical conjunction of opposites, giving rise on one hand to the concept of the philosopher's stone, lapis philosophorum, which is giving rise to more symbols of totality, and on the other hand to the concept of chemical combination, the idea of mixture seemed to come out of the revelation of Christ in relationship with the soul, according to Jung. That was from paragraph 72. Now going back here, we're talking about Clement, and sort of Clement was saying that the capital F Father sort of produced these basic elements, such as hot and cold, dry and moist, and that it's from their subsequent mixture that evil may have derived. Let's see what Jung has to say. Clement just said, for when these, the elements, were combined from without, choice was begotten in them as a child. So this mixture might have to do with the origins of freedom, or you could say of consciousness. Jung says, that is to say, through the mixing of the four elements, inequalities arose, which caused uncertainty, and so necessitated decisions or acts of choice. The four elements form the fourfold substance of the body and also of evil. So it seems like this is a sort of, again, we're taking from Clement here, and this is the idea of the right and left hands of God, and God as the sort of creator of these initial elements, which are then mixed. And through their mixture, inequality is created, uncertainty is created, decisions and acts of choice are needed, and the body and also evil, the existence of the body and the sort of quote fourfold substance of both the body and evil, so derived from this idea of the mixture of the four elements. So this initial fourfold substance, Jung says, quoting Clement, was carefully discriminated and sent forth from God, but when it was combined from without, according to the will of him who sent it forth, there arose, as a result of the combination, the preference, which rejoices in evil. This is a little bit of an arcane section, so we're going to continue. Jung says, the last sentence is to be understood as follows. The fourfold substance is eternal and God's child, but the tendency to evil was added from outside, was added from outside to the mixture willed by God. Thus, evil is not created by God or by anyone or by anyone else, nor was it projected out of him, nor did it arise of itself. Peter, who is engaged in these reflections, is evidently not quite sure how the matter stands. Okay, so this brings a little clarity. I'm sorry. I don't think this was not a quote from Clement, who we were quoting before. This is continuing from when he gave reference to Deuteronomy. So he's then quoting from, I guess, more Deuteronomy. But the last sentence, it does seem to say that the reference is the Clementine homilies in the apostolical constitutions. But anyway, he seems to understand that it's Peter, as in the rock, Peter, St. Peter, who doesn't quite get how the origins of evil are working here, because it seems to not come from God, but it has to sort of derive from somewhere else. And so Jung is sort of drawing out the confusion which is inherent in this point of view, I think. There seems to be a kind of initial fourfold, which is described as being sort of beyond evil, and then evil is supposed to result from the mixture, which apparently doesn't happen according to God's will anyway. So it says, it seems as if, without God's intending it, and possibly without his knowing it, the mixture of the four elements took a wrong turning. Though this is rather hard to square with Clement's idea of the opposite hands of God, quote, doing violence to one another. Obviously, Peter, the leader of the dialogue, finds it rather difficult to attribute the cause of evil to the Creator in so many words. The author of the homilies espouses a Petrine Christianity, distinctly high church or ritualistic in flavor. This, taken together with his doctrine of the dual aspect of God, brings him into close relationship with the early Jewish Christian church, where, according to the testimony of Epiphanius, we find the Ebionite notion that God had two sons, an elder one, Satan, and a younger one, Christ. Michaias, one of the speakers in the dialogue, suggests as much when he remarks that if good and evil were begotten in the same way, they must be brothers. Yeah, so this point of view, um, yeah, so this is the kind of doctrine of the dual aspect of God, which sort of brings this author in close relationship to the early Jewish Christian church, as you were saying. And this would seem to dovetail with the vision that we were talking about earlier, which had to do with a metaphysical conception of the unified God combined with an empirical observation of the reality of good and evil allows for a kind of unified conception of the Yahwistic and Christian perspectives on God. So this can unite Christianity with older strands of Judaism. Again, yes, so this notion is that um, this early sort of Jewish Christian church notion that God had two sons, an elder one, Satan, and a younger one, Christ. We're continuing with that theme here. Quote, in the Jewish Christian apocalypse, the quote, Ascension of Isaiah, we find in the middle section Isaiah's vision of the seven heavens through which he was wrapped. So now we talk about this vision of Isaiah. In connection with this theme of good and evil, I would say. Quote, first he saw Samael and his hosts, against whom a great battle was raging in the firmament. The angel then wafted him beyond him, Isaiah. The angel then wafted him beyond this into the first heaven and led him before a throne On the right of the throne stood angels who were more beautiful than the angels on the left. Those on the right, quote, all sang praises with one voice. But the ones on the left sang after them, and their singing was not like the singing of the first. In the second heaven, all the angels were more beautiful than in the first heaven, and there was no difference between them, either here or in any of the higher heavens. Evidently, Samael still has a noticeable influence on the first heaven, since the angels on the left are not so beautiful there. Also, the lower heavens are not so splendid as the upper ones, though each surpasses the other in splendor. The devil, like the Gnostic archons, dwells in the firmament, and he and his angels presumably correspond to astrological gods and influences. The gradation of splendor, going all the way up to the topmost heaven, shows that his sphere interpenetrates with the divine sphere of the Trinity, whose light in turn filters down as far as the lowest heaven. This paints a picture of complementary opposites balancing one another like right and left hands. Okay, so to summarize that, again, this is a vision, and it seems that this battle between higher and lower, or sort of the Samael and his evil hosts and the angels, this sort of spiritual war. This battle between higher and lower seems to correspond with the battle between right and left hands of God, and it sort of mirrors this struggle between good and evil, between Christ and Satan. So this idea is something like that the sort of archetypal conflict between Christ and Satan that we see is sort of reflected in the spiritual sphere. It seems to go all the way up into these higher heavens. Then we see a couple of other things to mention here. We saw that it it implies that the sort of dwelling place of the devil is in the firmament, and this is goes along with just like the Gnostic archons. Look up what the Gnostic archons are because I don't have time to go into that. And the idea that he and his angels, the angels of the devil, presumably correspond to astrological gods and influences. And here there's a clear link from here to the work of reinsoulment, the work relating to the ensoulment in Jung, the anima, is to, quote, liberate the soul. This is not in Gnosticism, in Hermeticism, in alchemy. The whole point of this is this idea, which I think we can see in some way corresponds with Christianity at this level, is to like what I'm noticing is that it seems to me here that Christianity, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and alchemy all align in this idea of liberating the soul from the influence of these quote unquote unconscious forces, which can be ultimately conceived as Gnostic archons, astrological gods, forces of the devil, unconscious archetypes. Call them how you will. They are real and influencing us. And the idea of, I would say, learning to take perspectives can help us to liberate the soul, the human soul, perhaps through relationship with Christ. I wouldn't want to cast that out as an option at this point. Um, okay, so that's fine. That's helpful to me to understand that. And it also said, I wanted to clarify something here. It said the devil, like the Gnostic archons, dwells in the firmament, and he and his angels presumably correspond to astrological gods and influences. The gradation of splendor going all the way up to the topmost heaven shows that his sphere, as in the sphere of the devil, interpenetrates with the divine sphere of the Trinity, whose light in turn filters down as far as the lowest heaven. So this vision, this mythological vision, sort of corroborates the idea that the sphere of the devil and the sphere of the Trinity, if you will, are not totally separate, but they deeply interpenetrate. This is why Jung says that this paints a picture of complementary opposites, balancing one another, like right and left hands. So from this point of view, we see that these opposites need not be considered to be at war. They may complement one another, just like the right and left hands do, which is the whole point of these organic metaphors that we see through Chinese philosophy, for example. This, eternal dualistic struggle between good and evil is in some way a distinctly Western notion. So a bit more here. Significantly enough, this vision, like the Clementine homilies, belongs to the pre-Manichean period of the second century, when there was as yet no need for Christianity to fight against its Manichean competitors. It might easily be a description of a genuine Yang-Yin relationship, a picture that comes closer to the actual truth than the privatio boni. Moreover, it does not damage monotheism in any way, since it unites the opposites just as Yang and Yin are united in Tao, which the Jesuits quite logically translated as God. It is as if the Manichean dualism first made the fathers conscious of the fact that until then, without clearly realizing it, they had always believed firmly in the substantiality of evil. This sudden realization might well have led them to the dangerously anthropomorphic assumption that what man cannot unite, God cannot unite either. The early Christians, thanks to their greater unconsciousness, were able to avoid this mistake. Okay. What Jung is getting at is that he regards that he regards the privatio boni, the doctrine of evil, as a privation of good and as lacking substance, is derived from the need to suppress Manichaeism, which only came after the first few centuries of Christian culture. And so he's arguing that it's as if when these Manichaeans became so prevalent and the church needed to suppress the Manichaeans, this was what caused the church fathers to realize that, hey, like our God is good. It's not, we don't want to reify this dualism. It seemed as if before that point, Christians actually did believe in the substantiality of evil, which they suddenly realized they. So Jung thinks that when they realized that this was kind of horrifying or shocking in a certain way to those people, the early church fathers, and Jung thinks that this led them to a quite dangerously anthropomorphic assumption that since we cannot unite good and evil, that God can't do so either, and that therefore God is all good and that evil is not real. Yeah, so another way to say this is that it seems that the early Christians believed more in the reality, they believed more readily in the substantiality of evil, whereas later Christians, who were suppressing dualism in the form of Manichaeism, fell into the assumption that God could not unite good and evil, much as it seems humans cannot unite good and evil, which Jung regards as a kind of anthropomorphic mistake. That he feels is the origin of this notion that God is the summum bonum, or all good. Okay, now to 105, which says, perhaps we may risk the conjecture that the problem of the Yahwistic God image, which had been consolated in men's minds ever since the Book of Job, continued to be discussed in Gnostic circles and in syncretistic Judaism generally, all the more eagerly as the Christian answer to this question, namely the unanimous decision in favor of God's goodness did not satisfy the conservative Jews. In this respect, therefore, it is significant that the doctrine of the two antithetical sons of God originated with the Jewish Christians living in Palestine. Inside Christianity itself, the doctrine spread to the Bogomils and the Cathars. In Judaism, it influenced religious speculation and found lasting expression in the two sides of the Kabalistic tree of the Sephirah, which were named Hesed and Din, love and justice. A rabbinical scholar, Zwiewolski, has been kind enough to put together for me a number of passages from Hebrew literature which have bearing on this problem. Okay, a couple small things here. So it seems that the conservative Jews, they knew all too well of the evils of God, citing, for example, the book of Job. So this early part of the Old Testament presents a very, very different God image, and therefore Jung regards it as significant that it was these early Jewish Christians living in Palestine who came up with this vision of these two antithetical sons of God. This battle between Christ and Satan. As this was designed to satisfy the more conservative Jews because they know all too well the reality of evil. This is obviously all later regarded as heresy. And so with this view, it did spread into Kabbalism through the two sides of the tree of the Sephirah, love and justice. Okay, now we have some quotes from the Hebrew tradition. 106. Joseph taught, quote, "What is the meaning of the verse, and none of you shall go out at the door of his house until the morning?" Exodus 12:22. Once permission has been granted to the destroyer, he does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Indeed, he even begins with the righteous. Commenting on Exodus 33:5, quote, "If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you." The Midrash says, quote, "Yahweh means he could wax wroth with you for a moment. That is, sorry, for that is the length of his wrath. As is said in Isaiah 26:20, quote, "Hide yourselves for a little moment until the wrath is past and destroy you." Yahweh gives warning here of his unbridled irascibility. If in this moment of divine wrath a curse is uttered, it will indubitably be effective. That is why Balaam, quote, "who knows the thoughts of the Most High, when called upon by Balak to curse Israel, was so dangerous an enemy, because he knew the moment of Yahweh's wrath." Okay, these quotes are designed to show us from the Judaic tradition the understanding, the knowledge of the, quote, irascibility of God. So the idea is that Yahweh is grumpy. Yahweh is grumpy, and he tells us as much. Goes on with Jung 107, quote, "God's love and mercy are named his right hand, but his justice and his administration of it are named his left hand." Thus we read in 1 Kings 22:19, quote, "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing beside him, on his right hand and on his left." The Midrash comments, quote, "Is there right and left on high? This means that the intercessors stand on the right and the accusers on the left." The comment on Exodus 15:6, quote, "Thy right hand, O Lord, glorious in power, thy right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemies," runs, quote, "When the children of Israel perform God's will, they make the left hand his right hand. When they do not do his will, they make even the right hand his left hand. God's left hand dashes to pieces, his right hand is glorious to save." So this is a conception of the love and justice of God that's conceived in terms of the right and left hands, which, according to Jung, is a sort of an expression which that this fulfillment of God's will unites the opposites, though they're still expressed as such. They're included in a high order reality. But again, the grumpy nature of Yahweh is known and understood. Again, quite different from how the right and left came to be divided in later Christianity. Jung says, the dangerous aspect of Yahweh's justice comes out in the following passage. Quote, even so, said the Holy One, blessed be he. If I create the world on the basis of mercy alone, its sins will be great. But on the basis of justice alone, the world cannot exist. Hence, I will create it on the basis of justice and mercy, and may it then stand. The Midrash on Genesis 18:23, Abraham's plea for Sodom, says, with Abraham speaking, quote, if thou desirest the world to endure, there can be no absolute justice. While if thou desirest absolute justice, the world cannot endure. Yet thou wouldst hold the cord by both ends, desiring both the world and absolute justice. Unless thou forgoest a little, the world cannot endure. Yeah, so basically this notion is that justice and mercy cannot exist without the other. If we wish the world to exist, we must endure its injustice. Quote, Yahweh prefers the repentant sinners even to the righteous, and protects them from his justice by covering them with his hand or by hiding them under his throne. A little more here. With reference to Habakkuk 2:3, quote, for still the vision awaits its time. If it seems slow, wait for it. Jonathan says, quote, should you say, we wait for his coming, but he does not, it stands written. Isaiah 30:18, quote, therefore will the Lord wait, that he may be gracious unto you. But since we wait and he waits too, what delays his coming? Divine justice delays it. It is in this sense that we have to understand the prayer of Jochanan, quote, may it be thy will, O Lord our God, to look upon our shame and behold our evil plight. Clothe thyself in thy mercies, cover thyself with thy grace, wrap thyself in thy loving kindness, and gird thyself with thy graciousness, and may thy goodness and gentleness come before thee. Which Jung says of that God is properly exhorted to remember his good qualities. Mentioning there's even a tradition that God prays to himself. Quote, may it be my will that my mercy may suppress my anger, and that my compassion may prevail over my other attributes. Okay, so what was this talking about? Well, it was saying essentially that we may wait around for God, but God does what he wants when he wants. I believe. Anyway, this is again a little difficult, this passage, so I'm going to continue. We're getting through this section. And so there's an idea here that God is being exhorted to remember his good qualities. So Jung thinks this is basically the theme is that we're aware that Yahweh is dangerous and has expresses his own justice when he wants to, and that we may pray to him to remember his good qualities. Briefly, Jung says that this tradition is borne out in the following story, which goes, Ishmael, the son of Elisha said, I once entered the innermost sanctuary to offer incense, and there I saw a Cathriel, Yahweh Zaboath, seated upon a high and exalted throne. He said to me, Ishmael, my son, bless me. And I answered him, May it be thy will that thy mercy may suppress thy anger, and that thy compassion may prevail over thy other attributes, so that thou mayest deal with thy children according to the attribute of mercy and stop short of the limit of strict justice. And he nodded to me with his head. Okay. So Jung says, it's not difficult to see from these quotations. What was the effect of Job's contradictory God image? It became a subject for religious speculation inside Judaism, and through the medium of the Kabbalah, it evidently had an influence on Jakob Bohme. In his writings, we find a similar ambivalence, namely the love and the wrath fire of God, in which Lucifer burns forever. In Bohm's book, Aurora. Okay, so what we're talking about here is this contradictory God image, this God image that seems to unite mercy and justice, that seems to give expression to the grumpiness or irascibility of Yahweh, that unites the opposites even though they're allowed to have expression, that we see evidenced in the book of Job, which obviously Jung wrote a lot about in answer to Job, probably his most controversial work. And Jung argues that this became a subject for religious speculation inside Judaism and was then drawn into the Kabbalah through the sides of the tree of life, love and justice, and influenced Bohm through there. Yeah, Bohm was an important influence on not only Jung, but on many Gnostics after that point. Okay, so what I'm going to do is two paragraphs that summarize this entire section, and then Jung moves on, and that's where we will swap into what follows after this point. So, Jung says, since psychology is not metaphysics, no metaphysical dualism can be derived from or imputed to its statements concerning the equivalence of opposites. It knows that equivalent opposites are necessary conditions inherent in the act of cognition, and that without them, no discrimination would be possible. It's not exactly probable that anything so intrinsically bound up with the act of cognition should be at the same time a property of the object. It's a very complicated way of saying that seeing things in terms of opposition, in terms of dichotomy, is a condition inherent within the act of cognition. Jung feels that this dichotomizing tendency is a quality of our conscious awareness that goes along with our conscious awareness. And he feels that it's not the case that that means that our judgments of discrimination of dichotomy are actual properties of those objects, but instead qualities of our judgment, which makes his argument about psychology and not metaphysics, according to Jung. Quote, it is far easier to suppose that it is primarily our consciousness which names and evaluates the differences between things, and perhaps even creates distinctions where no differences are discernible. I've gone into the doctrine of the privatio boni at such length because it is in a sense responsible for a too optimistic conception of the evil in human nature and for a too pessimistic view of the human soul. To offset this, early Christianity, with unerring logic, balanced Christ against an antichrist. For how can you speak of a high if there is no low, or right if there is no left, of God if there is no, of good if there is no bad, and the one is as real as the other? Only with Christ did the devil enter the world as the real counterpart of God. And in the early Jewish Christian circles, Satan, as already mentioned, was regarded as Christ's elder brother. Okay, so to summarize all of this, Jung argues that the psychological reality of good and evil does not need to result in metaphysical dualism, that the opposites are the basis of our discrimination, conscious discrimination, and that they are united, they may be united in God in a conception that can also unite some of the differences between the Judaic and Christian traditions, that there is precedence for this. The doctrine of the evil as the privation of good, the insubstantiality of evil, blinds us to the evil in nature and in our own nature, and it oppresses the human soul, causing us to blame ourselves. And he suggests that this is why in these early centuries that Christ was balanced with the Antichrist. Because according to him, logically and empirically, how can you speak of high if there is no low, or right if there is no left, of good if there is no bad, and the one is real as the other, and the one is as real as the other? Only with Christ did a devil enter the world as the real counterpart of God. And this was why Satan was regarded as Christ's elder brother. Okay, I'm going to pause this here and then I will pick it up from there because he's about to. He's sort of saying, okay, given all of that, what is then Jung going to say about all this? He has more to say. I'll get into that next time.